Private members' business, item number 516, standing in the name of Mr Pearson, relating to the Racehorse Legislation Amendment Welfare and Registration Bill.
The Honourable Mark Pearson.
Mr President, I move that leave be given to bring in a bill for an act to amend certain legislation to improve the welfare of racehorses and establish a racehorse registration scheme and for related purposes.
The question is the motion of the member. All those in favour, please say aye. Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Mr Pearson.
Mr President, Deputy President, I present this bill and move that the bill be read a first time and printed.
The question is that the bill be read a first time and printed. All those in favour, please say aye. Please say aye. Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Susan.
Racehorse Legislation Amendment Welfare and Registration Bill 2021, first reading.
Mr Pearson.
Deputy President, I move that this bill be now read a second time. I rise to introduce my private member's bill, the Racehorse Legislation Amendment Welfare and Registration Bill 2020, which, if passed, will significantly improve the welfare for horses used and abused in the horse racing industry. I would like to put on the public record that the current Chief Executive of Racing New South Wales, Peter Vlandis, did not respond to my request to meet with him during the time I was consulting with various groups about the drafting of this bill. This bill is necessary because the toll taken on the health and well-being of racehorses is intolerable and worsening each year as the pressure mounts to push horses to race even faster to win the mighty dollar for their owners. The racing industry tries to avoid accountability for the damage done to these majestic, sensitive animals, but thanks to campaigning by animal advocacy groups such as the Coalition for the Protection of Racehorses, they are now exposed to the bright light of public scrutiny. As Hall of Fame thoroughbred trainer Lee Friedman said, quote, "If we don't make real changes, the court of public opinion will bury racing. We have seen the slow but sure loss of racing social licence, represented by the declining numbers attending races. In the most recent figures from 2019, we see the Melbourne Cup recording its fourth consecutive year of declines in attendance and wagering turnover. Industry revenue is declining at an annualised rate of 2.3% over the 5 years through 2018 to 19 to $1.5 billion. The total attendance for the Victorian Spring Carnival's Derby, Cup, Oaks and Stakes fell by 9% in 2019. COVID-19 put a stop to public attendances, but we can only assume the trajectory remains downward, given the ongoing deaths of horses on the tracks and the highly public scandals showing ex-racehorses' cruelty treated at knackeries, and the Melbourne Cup winning trainer Darren Weir being charged with engaging in the torture and abuse of racehorses by the illegal use of electronic devices known as jiggers. Back in 2008, the industry scoffed when the newly formed Coalition for the Protection of Racehorses first raised concerns about unacceptable racing injuries, the cruelty of the whip, the overbreeding of foals and the numbers of retired racehorses sent to the slaughterhouse. Fast forward 12 years and the industry knows it has a real problem with public perceptions on its hands. It is clear, however, from the ongoing scandals that it requires legislators to mandate that cruelty to horses is unambiguously criminal in nature and that the only way to ensure, quote, whole-of-life, unquote, racehorse welfare is by government intervention, including sanctions for breaches or statutory requirements. I move now to outline the major welfare initiatives of this bill. The objects of the bill are to prohibit the carrying or use of a whip or the wearing of spurs by persons who ride or drive a horse at horse races, to prohibit the riding or driving of a horse that is fitted with a tongue tie during the horse races, to establish a registration scheme for horses that are owned, bred or kept by horse racing industry participants under the Thoroughbred Racing Act 1996, to prohibit the racing of a horse unless a horse is registered under the Thoroughbred Racing Act 1996 and is at least 3 years of age. To prohibit the slaughtering of horses registered under the Thoroughbred Racing Act 1996, and to establish a rehoming scheme for horses that are registered under the Thoroughbred Racing Act 1996 that are not used or intended to be used for horse racing. Spurs are sharp pieces of steel, points, attached to the jockey's boots. Jockeys kick backwards, forcing the spurs into the horse's exposed flank. The International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities, of which Australia is both a member and a signatory to their rules, has banned the use of spurs under Article 32, Rule 4, which begs the question, why are we continuing to use spurs in Australia's racing? A jockey's legs are a lot stronger than a jockey's arm. A whip is used one-handed, whereas spurs are on both feet and can cause significant lacerations to both sides of the horse's flank. Within the industry, there are those who are concerned that as more restrictions are placed on the use of the whip, the greater the uptake of spurs. It is therefore necessary to prohibit the use of spurs in tandem with a ban on horsewhipping. In 2014, former Racing New South Wales Chief Steward Ray Murray, a steward with 46 years' experience, was part of a national campaign to prohibit the use of spurs. Murray was quoted as saying that spurs, quote, were probably outdated in today's society, unquote, and that Australia and Singapore were the only mainstream racing jurisdictions left in the world that allowed them. RSPCA Australia is opposed to the use of spurs because, quote, they inflict pain and distress, unquote, and argues that they should be progressively withdrawn to meet community expectations and commit to improving horse welfare in Australia. Unfortunately, that campaign failed and spurs has faded as a concern. With the focus now being very much on the use of the whip, I would argue that suffering caused by spurs is under the public's radar because it is difficult to see the spurs in action, and so the public pressure is absent in restricting their use. My bill unequivocally bans the wearing of spurs by jockeys in horse racing. The use of the whip during racing was once widely practiced around the world, but increasing public awareness about animal sentience and changed attitudes towards animal welfare have put the industry on notice that this practice is indeed cruel, and the continued use of the whip creates a reputation risk for the future of racing. In 2020, can there be any ethical justification for using a whip to make a horse run faster? Indeed, consider the fact that if a horse was seen on the road being whipped, the person whipping the horse would be roundly condemned and risk being charged with animal cruelty. We regularly hear how horses are, quote, born to race, or they naturally race, or as British Racing Authority states, no horse can be made to race against its will. Perhaps so, but what about forcing the horse to race faster and longer than they wish? Is that not the purpose of whips and spurs? Anyone watching thoroughbreds in a paddock will indeed see them running for short bursts, but not the length and intensity of a commercial race. Welfare arguments concerning the use of the whip have a long history, but the racing industry has done nothing more than pay lip service to public concern by regulating rather than banning the use of the whip. In a public survey commissioned by the RSPCA Victoria, 69% of those polled do not want horses to be whipped during racing, and 71% surveyed who attended horse racing events and placed bets would continue to do so even if whips were banned. In 1982, Norway was the first country to outlaw the use of whips, other than for safety purposes in controlling an unruly horse, and a complete ban was introduced by Norway's racing authority in 2009. Former Norway racing CEO Hans Petter Eriksson recently stated that, quote, during my time as CEO of the Norwegian Jockey Club and the Øvrevoll racecourse in Norway from 2006 to 2016, I became convinced that the use of the whip in horse racing was unnecessary for the safety of the jockeys and that it was counterproductive for the welfare and performances of the horses. He also confirmed that the complete ban did not adversely affect race attendance or wagering figures at all. There is a substantial and growing body of evidence that the whip is indeed cruel, causes suffering, and is ultimately ineffectual in determining the outcome of a race. Just this month, two studies into the use of the whip were released. Renowned veterinary expert Professor Paul McGreevy from the University of Sydney School of Veterinary Science was one on the research team that sought to determine whether the whip use is a useful tool for encouragement, given that the racing industry defends the whip use as, quote, giving everyone a fair chance of winning. The study, quote, is whip use important to thoroughbred racing integrity? What stewards' reports reveal about the fairness in punters, jockeys and horses? Examined stewards' reports from both whipping and whipping-free races in Great Britain. Information was drawn from an analysis over a 3-year period with 1,178 horses running in 126 races. In conclusion, they found no statistically significant differences for the two types of races between race finishing times, stewards' reports, movement or interference on course or incidents related to jockey behaviour. The second paper, titled, quote, A Comparative Neurohistological Assessment of Gluteal Skin Thickness and Cutaneous Nociceptor Distribution in Horses and Humans, was written with the colleagues including Dr. Lydia Tong, a leading veterinary pathologist. The study compared skin from 10 human cadavers and 20 deceased horses, looking at skin structure and nerve supply. The findings show that whilst horse skin is thicker in general than human skin, the part of the skin that is thicker does not insulate them from pain that is generated during a whip strike. The evidence was clear that humans and horses have the equivalent basic anatomic structures to detect pain in the skin. This was not surprising, as horses, like humans, need robust yet sensitive skin to respond to touch, say from flying insects or other horses. From this, we can deduce that horses are likely to feel as much pain as humans would when they're being whipped. Repeated strikes of the whip in horses that are fatigued as they end a race are likely to be distressing and cause suffering. A horse's loss of agency as it undergoes this kind of repeated treatment is thought to lead to learned helplessness, said Professor McGreevy. To force a horse into a state of learned helplessness is a very sad situation and is the foundation of horse racing. The Australian racing industry continues to prevaricate and procrastinate. In September 2020, Racing Victoria announced that they would lobby Racing Australia to begin phasing out the whip, commencing from January 1st, 2021. They support the development of a new framework to transition the industry to an ultimate prohibition on the use of whips for purposes other than the protection of safety of horses and jockeys. New South Wales Racing refused to support the Victorian initiative. At its November 2020 board meeting, Racing Australia failed to adopt the proposal, given that Racing Australia stipulates that any change in the rules requires a national consensus. The outcome is hardly surprising. The board has said it is still investigating the welfare implications of the use of the whip, but the pace of reform is glacial and uncertain, and horses deserve protection now. They, in fact, should be given the benefit of the doubt principle. I would argue that this failure to act by the racing authorities, combined with the scientific evidence of the harm caused to horses and the research which conclusively established that whipping had zero impact on race outcomes, puts owners, trainers and jockeys at the risk of prosecution for animal cruelty under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 1979 of New South Wales. POCTA is not excluded from application to horse racing in New South Wales, but in practice the main enforcement agency, the RSPCA, has been content to rely on industry self-regulation. The current Australian rules of racing, adopted by Racing New South Wales, permit the use of the whip a maximum of 5 times in non-consecutive strides prior to the 100-metre mark, and at the rider's discretion in the final 100 metres of a race, where its use in consecutive strides is permitted. These self-regulatory efforts have been made to curb the whipping of horses in the context of the horse race-specific rules established by and under the Thoroughbred Racing Act 1996. Now that we have definitive evidence that whipping causes pain, Section 4.2d of POCTA, Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, must surely be invoked. Quote, an act of cruelty committed upon an animal includes a reference to any act or omission, as a consequence of which the animal is unreasonably, unnecessarily or unjustifiably inflicted with pain, beaten, abused or overused. Tong and McGreevy's report established that there is no discernible benefit derived from horsewhipping during a race, which leaves us merely with accepted industry practice as the inadequate fig leaf to cover for behaviour which can no longer be supported as reasonable, justifiable or necessary. To remove any ambiguity, however, the bill amends POCTA with Section 17A inserted to prohibit both the carrying and using of a whip during a horse race. I have prohibited the carrying of a whip on the basis that a horse can become distressed just by seeing the whip and remembering the pain it causes. There is no need for jockeys to use or carry whips for the purposes of control and safety, as identified in the newly released research findings, and given that whips have not been used in Norway under any circumstances since 2009 without any adverse effects. We now come to the pernicious practice of applying tongue ties to racehorses, which I am also seeking to prohibit by way of the amendment to the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act under a new Section 17B. A tongue tie is a strap that immobilises a horse's tongue. They are claimed to prevent abnormal airway obstruction caused by the horse pulling back its tongue and forcing his or her soft palate backwards. Endoscopic examination has shown that displacement of the soft palate during exercise can obstruct a horse's airway and limit oxygenation, reducing the racing performance. Despite the widespread use of tongue ties, a study established by the European College of Veterinary Surgeons found that in 70% of cases of horses with soft palate issues, tongue ties made absolutely no difference to airway obstructions. In reality, the reason for using tongue ties can be found in a survey published in the Equine Veterinary Journal article, quote, factors associated with tongue tie use in Australian standard bred racehorses, unquote. The majority of trainers use tongue ties primarily to control the horse during racing. In the same way, in the same survey, 23% of Australian trainers reported usage resulting in lacerations, bruising and the swelling of the tongue, difficulty in swallowing and behaviour indicating stress. Salivary cortisol concentrations increased over the tongue tie application, indicating physiological stress responses. Given that there is mounting evidence that tongue ties can cause stress and injury and the limited benefits for airway obstructions, I have no hesitation in including this prohibition in my bill. This would bring horse racing in line with all other equestrian sports in Australia, which do not allow the use of tongue ties. This bill also addresses the controversial issue of racing skeletally immature horses by setting a minimum age of 3 years before horses can legally be raced in New South Wales. Horses are not skeletally mature until they reach 5 years of age. For all of racing history, up until changes introduced in the 1980s, horses were not raced until they were at least 3 years old. This was based on the legitimate concerns that juvenile horses are at risk of serious injury during racing due to their underdeveloped physiology. Multiple studies have concluded that there is compelling evidence that fractures occur more frequently in younger horses and the risk decreases with age. The most common injury is skin soreness or dorsal metacarpal disease, which is estimated to affect up to 80% of 2-year-olds in Australia. A frequently cited study, quote, risk factors for musculoskeletal injuries in 2-year-old thoroughbred horses, found that 85% of racing 2-year-olds in Australia were reported as suffering at least one incident of injury or disease. The only benefit of racing 2-year-olds is the additional profits that can be made. Owners can get a turnaround on their investment 12 months earlier than if the industry had retained the 3-year-old racing threshold. Leading equine racing veterinarian Percy Sykes is quoted as saying, "There's a great incentive to race their horses too young and too immature. In the old days, you bought your yearlings, you broke them in, you castrated them, hopefully with analgesia, you turned them out, and you didn't think about them until 2 years later, and most recently 3-year-olds. The current owners want 2-year-old racing, and I think it's a pity because it certainly does cause the breakdown of a lot of 2-year-olds," unquote. My bill also prohibits slaughtering of racehorses. For many years, racehorses that were no longer capable of bringing race winnings were discarded and sent to a grisly fate, the slaughterhouse. All the talk of equine heroes and elite athletes rings hollow when we see former champions being shot for pet food. In 2017, there were more than 30 knackeries around Australia killing horses for pet meat. There were also 2 abattoirs licensed to export horse meat, and they were slaughtering on average 9,000 horses per year. A busy and lucrative trade that helped solve the problem of what to do with horses that failed and were retired racehorses that are not suitable for breeding, and where the numbers are so great that sale yards are overwhelmed and the dogger has their pick. Due to a public backlash as a result of the images taken by animal activists, New South Wales Racing introduced a ban on sending racehorses to slaughter. But in 2019, an ABC investigation exposed the continued widespread slaughter of racehorses for pet food and human consumption at abattoirs and knackeries in both New South Wales and Queensland. The ABC investigation investigated Camden horse sales, a livestock auction, recording vast numbers of branded, registered racehorses passing through the yards. Camden Horse Sales was not approved by Racing New South Wales to sell racehorses, but this did not prevent ex-racehorses being sold to kill buyers and ending up in knackeries, including the Luddenham Pet Meats, which sells horse meat to greyhound industry. Racing New South Wales cannot claim ignorance of these sales that are the breach of the rules. In June 2018, a former trainer, Sandra Jorgensen, contacted Racing New South Wales to advise them that a branded thoroughbred filly had been sold at Camden Horse Sales to a kill buyer. Another former trainer, Pam Webber, also contacted Racing New South Wales from the Luddenham sales to advise stewards that thoroughbred horses were being auctioned at that sale. It is my belief that industry self-regulation has failed and that racehorses will continue to be slaughtered unless full force of the law is applied. Under 17D of my bill, a person must not cause or arrange for a horse that is registered under the Thoroughbred Racing Act 1996 to be slaughtered. It is a criminal offence with a maximum penalty of 50 penalty units or 6 months imprisonment. This prohibition includes the killing of ex-racehorses down the back paddock, unless a vet has certified that euthanasia was required due to injury or disease. This will work well with the new end-of-life welfare program introduced by Racing New South Wales, which will pay for the humane euthanasia of horses on welfare grounds. In response to the growing public concerns about the fate of horses no longer of use to the industry, Racing Australia introduced traceability rules 3 years ago to track horses from birth to retirement. The industry has also been under pressure to reduce industry wastage from the overbreeding of foals. In 2007, 18,255 thoroughbred foals were born in Australia. In 2017, there were only 13,823 thoroughbred foals born, and so the increased accountability was clearly having an impact. A 2014 Australian study tracked foals born into the industry. Only 66% entered training and 5% were exported overseas to other countries. Approximately 25% of the foals had been moved out of the industry, either sold, rehomed or retired with no follow-up. 3% were used as breeding stock, and for the remaining 6%, their situation was unknown. In addition to the foals born each year, there are racehorses retired each year. What happens to them? Some of them will be used for breeding, others will be bought for careers in equestrian sports, but that still leaves a lot unaccounted for. Again, the question needs to be asked, where are they? Where are these ghost animals? As recently as October 30th, 2020, the Sydney Morning Herald published an article providing evidence that despite all the assurances from Racing New South Wales to the contrary, that retired thoroughbreds were still being sent to knackeries or abattoirs. Some of those slaughtered were ageing broodmares, now infertile or too old to breed. They become a liability for the breeder. They are no longer of any use, yet if kept, still need to be fed and cared for while taking up a spot that could be given to a fertile mare capable of providing the breeder with a return on their investment. This is why some brood mares end up being sold to knackeries and abattoirs such as Merrimist, which featured in the ABC investigation. In 2016, Racing New South Wales introduced a horse welfare fund by a deduction of 1% of prize money paid in New South Wales. The scheme provides resources for the care, retraining and eventual rehoming of New South Wales thoroughbred horses, including retraining the equestrian sports or rehoming as companion animals. It has a team of staff to manage the program and seeks to establish partnerships with riding schools, pony clubs, local agricultural societies and other equestrian organisations to promote the rehoming of thoroughbred horses. In the ABC defamation case brought by Racing New South Wales as a result of the investigation into horses sent to slaughter, New South Wales CEO Peter Vlandis stated that Racing New South Wales had rehomed 10,000 horses. As ABC's counsel stated, quote, "It's not right to say we, as in Racing New South Wales, as the regulator has rehomed the horses because most of the rehoming is done by industry participants," unquote, thus giving no credit whatever to all those racing participants who are in fact responsible for finding the majority of homes for the retired horses. That is why this bill will establish a statutory scheme for mandatory lifetime traceability and rehoming, with penalties for breaches. Regulations will provide the details of the scheme, and equine organisations will be consulted on how these schemes will operate. The effect of the registration scheme is that racehorses must be registered by the age of 6 months, with provision for adult horses and interstate transfers. Horses cannot be raced if they are not registered. All changes of ownership are tracked. Any change in ownership must be registered, and any serious injury or death of a registered horse must be recorded. The so-called sport of kings has been exposed as profiteering from the distress of blood-soaked bodies and its victims. The innocent horses broken, beaten, tormented, all for the holy dollar. One would at least expect the Melbourne Cup to deliver the industry's ethical gold standard. Well, last year, yet another horse fell and died in front of a worldwide audience. Anthony van Dyck became the 7th horse to die across the last 7 Melbourne Cups. A mortality rate of over 4% has become the norm in a 4-minute circular journey. A 4% mortality rate in a 3-week live export journey would trigger a major investigation with a view to shut down the industry. So why is horse racing immune to such scrutiny? It cannot be, it will not be. The time will come when the industry loses its social licence completely. Until that historic day, the bill protects the magnificent, majestic horses trapped within the industry from the worst of its practices. I commend this bill to the House.
Government